I basically agree that the biggest problem we have is this huge debt, which continues to be growing. And the politicians are unable to address it. In fact, President Trump, on one hand, is trying to save money through Doge. However, at the same time, he's trying to do things like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security. Both of these ideas to me are dumb. Also, there are plenty of people, and me as a retired psychiatrist, I see that all the time. There are many people who don't pay tax, largely people who are in private business. My question is, how do you see the situation going forward?
I would say muted growth. In other words, less than capacity growth. So even in the post-recession years, I hate calling them the Obama years because I don't think that this was something that Obama owns, but he happened to be the resident of the White House when it happened. We grew at 1.6, 1.7% for those 8 years. And so there was positive real growth every one of those years. There was no recession, and yet it was very muted growth relative to what we're used to. And your question for me is whether or not I believe there's anything we can do to right the ship. And I have to give a thorough answer here. Nobody is serious about this question if they're not talking about entitlements. So when Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security is off the table for political discussion, the economics and the finances of it all are pretty irrelevant. We will not move the needle until we get to some serious discussion of entitlement reform. President Trump largely took that off the table. There's some I talked to in the administration that believe he will end up wanting to do something more serious about it near the end of this term. I am not of that opinion. I think he would rather punt it to a successor. I'm very critical of President Obama's decision to ignore his own commission when the Simpson-Bowles Commission had been appointed to come up with real serious grown-up solutions to a lot of these things that probably nobody was going to like perfectly, but at least nevertheless showed some movement. But I am willing to say, as someone who's as much of a deficit hawk, fiscal hawk as one could be, that I'd be content if we at least resumed growing more than the debt is growing. Okay, so I would like to reduce the 36 trillion of debt. But in the meantime, if the debt is growing at 4 to 5% a year and the economy is growing at 2 to 3% a year, that is the real problem. In theory, if you found an equilibrium, a stable state where we have the debt we have now, and then the debt's going to go up 3% next year and the economy is going to go up 3%. And we're going to run the debt to GDP in that kind of equilibrium. It's not very realistic. Recessions do come and debt doesn't suddenly drop when all of a sudden your GDP drops. But if in theory that could happen, it would be less of a mathematical issue. Here's the problem. Nobody's even talking about that. Getting us down to a 3% budget deficit to GDP, getting the total debt to GDP down below 20%, you have to have a robust plan for real economic growth. And so there are trade-offs that will be involved. And I'm in total agreement with you that a lot of the things put out are not serious. I am one who doesn't blame the politicians as much because I know where it comes from. The people don't want the spending cuts. Everybody wants to cut spending. And then once you put one thing out there that we would actually cut spending on, you get the millions of people in opposition to it. Ultimately, that will end up having to happen. And if we're actually talking about something more fiscally sustainable, which is the heart of your question, the mandatory spending has gotten up to 70% of outlays. That's going to have to be addressed, period.